So I just wanted to thank everyone today for being able to join us for Moving Towards Sexual Pleasure and Emotional Healing After Female Genital Cutting Part 2. This conversation will be a continuation of our first event from a year ago that aims to further explore female genital cutting, sexuality, and its connection to mental health. Since FGC comes with a multitude of psychological impacts that harm survivors' sexual functioning, and too little attention is given to these issues, this important discussion will continue to talk about how survivors can begin to move towards their own sexual pleasure and emotional healing after FGC. During this event, we will hear from two speakers, Haddi Ceesay and Nazneen Vasi, who will share their insight and professional experience to help us introduce the topics of shame, sex, and sexual pleasure after FGC in a panel discussion moderated by Sayo U.S. Executive Director Maria Taher. Today, you will all be part of a difficult but important conversation on how the topic of psychosexual and mental health impacts of FGC can affect survivors. This webinar will allow survivors and not survivors alike a place to better understand the process of sexual and emotional healing after FGC. If we can go to the next slide. So for those of you who are unaware, Sayo is a nonprofit organization based out of the US and India whose mission is to empower Asian and other communities to abandon the practice of FGC and uplift the voices of survivors. Sayo is the Bora Gujarati word for Sahiyo, or friends, which reflects our mission to create social change through dialogue, education, and collaboration based on community involvement. We do this by utilizing storytelling in a variety of ways throughout our programming to support survivors in working communities. One such program is our Voices to End FGMC project, a digital storytelling project in which advocates get to share their story in connection to this work. You'll get a chance to see two of these videos in a few minutes. And today we're also joined by Sayo's amazing US Executive Director, Maria Taher. And thank you so much for joining us today, Maria, if you'd like to give a few sentences about yourself as well.
Oh, yeah. Thanks, Kate, so much. Hello, everybody. My name is Maria Taher. I'm one of the 5 co-founders of Sayo and looking forward to this event.
Thank you so much, Maria. If we could go to the next slide. So before we get started, I'd like to quickly go over our agenda for our event today. So today we're going to start with the introduction of our amazing speakers, and following that, each speaker will have the opportunity to present their work and explore how their work provides support for survivors of FGC along their healing journey. Then, after the speaker presentations, we'll lead a short panel discussion moderated by Maria, with the hopes to have enough time for audiences to ask our expert panelists questions as well. And if you'd like to ask our panelists questions during this time, please feel free to submit your question in the chat box and we'll select a few to ask them live if we have time. So if we can go to the next slide. Before we officially introduce our speakers, we wanted to share 2 videos from our Voices to End FGMC digital storytelling collection to ground us in the conversation today around FGC and its connection to shame and sexual pleasure. We'll be showing these videos back to back, and during the process, please feel free to type your reflections and thoughts in the videos and the stories told in the chat box. Additionally, if you get overwhelmed at any point in this process, please do feel free to step back. Alrighty, if we can go ahead and watch the first video, Women Divided. Sorry, I think there might be an issue with the audio.
I remember when I started to notice older men looking at me differently. It filled me with anger and disgust. When I was 12 and my body started to change, I taped my chest down under my clothes. I always admired powerful women in stories. I loved reading about Cleopatra, Joan of Arc, and Elizabeth I. But I wasn't a queen. I was quiet, shy, and lonely. My father was an evangelical minister in Boston. I was homeschooled and have 7 siblings. We were part of a large global ministry. My mom would take my sisters and I to an annual conference for women called Pure Life, where being a pure daughter of God was emphasized. To admit sexual desires was not of God. It was shameful and dirty. Only in the context of marriage was sex acceptable. It went so deep that I felt shame about my body, as if by being a woman, I represented sin itself. As I got older, I realized these feelings of shame were not natural. Loving myself and my body felt so much better. In college, I began to challenge the ideas I grew up with, and I could feel my confidence grow. I learned about the ways women around the world are made to feel shame about who they are and their bodies. Female genital cutting in particular is a practice based on the idea that something about the female body is wrong and needs to be changed. While female genital cutting is often defended as a way to preserve tradition, the root of that tradition comes from an attempt to control women's sexuality and suppress their humanity. When a woman is taught to suppress her physicality or passion, she becomes divided within herself. A woman divided is a woman denied the fullness of what it truly means to be human.
Yeah, thank you so much. And we just want to thank Nicole for sharing that video. I think it's a really powerful exploration of the ways in which women are often taught to feel shame about their bodies and shame around sexuality. And so next up, we'll be watching a video titled Shame.
It's 1980. I'm 7 years old on summer vacation in Karachi, Pakistan. One morning, my aunt comes to take me shopping. I'm excited. We head to Sadr and stop at an unfamiliar apartment building. My aunt says, I just have to run an errand. I follow her into a dark entrance up 2 flights of stairs. We pause outside a badly scratched door, and my aunt rings the bell. An elderly woman greets us. She's dressed in a ghagra koti and her head is covered with a dupatta. The apartment is cramped and hot, musty. The woman leads us into a brightly painted room. Suddenly, and without any warning, she grabs me and pushes me onto my back. She strips off my panties and spread eagles me with well-practiced efficiency. Before I know what's happening, I feel a sharp, hot pain between my legs. As I cry out, she says triumphantly, "Done." She quickly bundles me into a cloth diaper and brings me to my feet. Only then do I notice a pair of old scissors with blood on them on a tray next to her. I hear my aunt say, "Auntie ne salam karo?" I obey. The whole thing takes less than 15 minutes. I'm filled with shame. My mom had caught me exploring my body a few weeks before. "This is a sin," she'd said. So I believe I have been punished. Over the years, I've wondered, would I have grown up more confident if I'd never been cut? Would I have been better able to appreciate and enjoy my body? Or been more comfortable with sex and intimacy? I will never know. I think back to that salam and my blood boils. I hope my story will break the circle of silence that has allowed genital cutting to continue.
Yeah, and so again, we just wanted to show these videos to help ground our conversation and the connection between shame, sexuality, and FGC. So now I think we'd like to start by introducing our panelists today. And so first up, we are joined by Haddi Ceesay. She is a health educator and research assistant at Heart. Haddi is also currently a PhD student at the City University of London, researching young people's sexual and reproductive health education in low-income countries. Haddi has experience working with survivors of sexual and gender-based violence, both in the US and abroad, including FGC and early child marriage survivors. So thank you so much for joining us today, Haddi. And if you would like to take a few seconds to introduce yourself as well, please feel free to do so.
Hi, Kate. I think you've done quite a good job at just giving the background. So hi, I'm Haddi, and yeah, I do a lot of work around sexual and reproductive health in general. And I am really thankful for y'all for having me on this panel today. And I look forward to the rest of the program. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we're looking forward to hearing you speak as well. So our next wonderful panelist today is Nazneen Vasi. She is the founder of Body Harmony Physical Therapy and is a licensed pelvic floor therapist with 15 years of experience. Nazneen has worked in the field of pelvic rehabilitation since 2016 and has developed a passion and expertise in areas such as bladder and bowel function and health, sexual function and health, as well as chronic pelvic pain and prenatal and postpartum care. And again, thank you so much for joining us today, Nazneen. And if you would like to introduce yourself as well.
Sorry. Hi, everyone. I'm Nazneen. Thank you for having me here. And I look forward to talking with you all about the pelvic floor.
Yeah, thank you so much. And once again, thank you so much to you both. And we're so honored to have you with us today to share with your research and experience. And I think without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Nazneen, you'll explore your work in pelvic floor therapy and its connection to healing after FGC.
Hi, everyone again. So I'm a physical therapist. I specialize in pelvic floor rehabilitation for both men and women of all ages. How do I switch to the next slide? So the pelvic floor comprises of the external genitalia, which is the vulva, the perineum, the pelvic muscles, the ligaments, bones, joints, nerve, fascia. The pelvic floor muscles, we have 3 layers that go from superficial to deep. And the 3 main functions of our pelvic floor include sphincteric to keep us bowel and bladder continent, sexual pleasure, and supportive to our pelvic organs. I'm going to go over the muscles of the pelvic floor from superficial to deep. So can I change the slide? How do I? Thank you. The superficial muscles of the pelvic floor the first one is the bulbocavernosus, which starts at the clitoral hood and inserts into the perineal body. It's also known as the guardian of the vagina. When a woman is in any sort of negative emotion, that is the first muscle on her body to contract to protect us. The other 2 muscles are the ischiacavernosus and the superficial transverse perineal. The deeper layers, when we go into them, you have the deep pelvic muscles, which are the levator ani, which basically means elevate the anus. This muscle helps to keep us continent, and then the deep hip flexor rotators, the deep hip external rotators are also, they function as hip muscles and pelvic floor muscles. So any pain in the pelvic floor can refer into the hip and vice versa, from the hip into the pelvic floor. All our pelvic floor muscles together, all these muscles should function optimally for sexual pleasure and orgasms. An orgasm is a contract release of these muscles. Trauma of any kind to these muscles, direct or indirect, in the pelvic region can reduce sexual pleasure and even create pain with sexual function. The nerve supply to the pelvic floor, we have the pudendal nerve, which supplies the tip of the clitoris, and another branch goes to the anus and one to the perineum. Trauma, direct or indirect, to the pudendal nerve can present as burning, stabbing sensation at the tip of the clitoris, a constant itching in and around the anus, and pain with sitting in the perineal region, pelvic region, or in and around the vulva. And then the bones of the pelvis, the bony pelvis is made up of 3 bones, and which enclose our muscles and house all our pelvic organs. Again, trauma to the pelvis anywhere, the ligaments, joints, nerves, muscles can present as sexual sexual pain, incontinence, and loss of support for the organs, which can then cause prolapses. Can we skip ahead to the slides? Can we skip ahead with the slides, please? Yeah, and one more slide. Yeah. So what is pelvic floor dysfunction? Pelvic floor dysfunction can, like I said, present in many different ways, right? It is a dysfunction in the musculoskeletal and neurological support of the pelvic floor. Physical therapists are experts in the musculoskeletal system. Most MDs may only look at the organs and their function and not underlying musculoskeletal dysfunction. So physical therapists will look at your muscles, will look at the scar tissue, the nerves, the connective tissue to figure out what is going on and how we can help you. Pelvic floor dysfunction can result due to trauma, surgery, childbirth, with perineal tears and episiotomies, accidents such as with horse riding, bicycling, and sometimes no known cause at all. What ends up happening is the pelvic floor muscles become short and weak, which means they go into a spasm, which is a protective mechanism of the muscle to protect itself and the area that it's supporting. And this in turn leads to the muscles becoming weak. So then, pelvic floor dysfunction will present as pelvic pain, again, incontinence, constipation, and all of this affects a human's quality of life. Trauma can also lead to the pelvis, can result in long-term chronic, dysfunction due to scar tissue. The scar tissue, whenever we have trauma, we have scar tissue. The scar tissue gets adhered or gets stuck. And if it's not worked on, it then pulls on all the muscles and, connective tissue and supportive tissue around that area. It is really important for us to advocate for our pelvic health, especially for women, because there's not a lot of information out there and not a lot of healthcare practitioners are trained specifically in the pelvic floor and the support system of the pelvic floor. Can we get to the next slide, please? So how does physical therapy help? Physical therapy, pelvic PTs can help to restore and balance pelvic activity and function. We use individualized treatment techniques for rehabilitation, based on an extensive evaluation assessment. Treatment techniques that I use include postural alignment of the pelvis, internal and external pelvic muscle assessment and treatment. We do digital treatment of the pelvic floor muscles, neuromuscular re-education, and of course, a home exercise program, which includes the use of dilators or wands to stretch the pelvic floor muscles at home. And also we teach patients how to do skin rolling and scar tissue release to have everything flowing optimally around the pelvic floor. Can we get to the next slide, please? As in pelvic floor PT, as a pelvic floor physical therapist, I believe in a holistic approach, meaning we need a multidisciplinary team to help a patient. So we work closely with physicians and other healthcare practitioners, pain management practitioners, yoga, acupuncture, psychological services, and support stress management and nutrition. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nazneen, for that wonderful presentation. And I know there's so much to explore there. And unfortunately, we have to move on to Haddi, but we're so excited for Haddi's presentation as well. And again, if you guys have any questions that come up, please feel free to ask them in the Q&A box. And without further ado, I think I'll hand it over to Haddi for your presentation.
Hi, again, I'm Haddi Ceesay, and I work with Heart, and I'm a researcher, and mainly this presentation is, I guess, mainly going to go into just some of the research that I've done around FGM, because when I was doing my master's, I focused my thesis on how girl, girls and women who have undergone FGM, basically how they describe well-being, or how FGM has impacted what their well-being is. So Maria, if you could please start. So to start off with, well-being in general is a multidimensional construct. So it's not something that can easily be explained, or it's not something that's easily defined, because it touches on so many aspects of our lives, which are physical, emotional, social, economic, psychological, and just so many other aspects of our lives. But when I was doing my research, I focused well-being because I was dealing with FGM, and I from literature review and from my experience working with FGM survivors, I knew that some of the place I guess some of the life aspects that a lot of girls and women struggled with was life satisfaction, sexual health satisfaction, mental and emotional health as well. But because I was doing my study in the Gambia, which is quite a religious population, I decided to also look into spirituality and religiosity, and to see how that impacts FGM. So with, I guess, this presentation in general, it's not just about my study, but also what the literature says around FGM and well-being and healing. All right, next slide, please. So the research, and just from speaking to survivors, there's evidence that FGM does impact women's health, and but with the population I focused mainly on women who are between 15 to 24, and because as young, it's basically a transitional age, and FGM is something that that young women, well, girls and women undergo when they're much younger. So I felt like it was important to look at how they're impacted as they transition into adulthood. And all of the women that I had spoken to had described the fact that, or had discussed the fact that FGM had impeded their health, especially their sexual health, either through pregnancy complications, poor period pains, or just poor sexual health in general. And it did impact their mental health and views on religion, especially around FGM. And with the term, in terms of religion, it's the fact that like a lot of them initially tried to make peace with the fact that like they had gone through FGM because because they're Muslim, or they had some kind of religious attachment. But once they realized that religion had no bearings towards FGM, it ended up propelling them more to, I guess, become more active in dispelling a lot of religious myths. So yeah, next slide, please. There's also with my research and research in general, a lot of people, all of the women I had spoken to talked about how anxious it made them, and just the stress around FGM, and especially when it comes to sex and intimacy. And I especially remember one of the young women that I had spoken to who was unmarried and also had never had sex, and she talked about how when she thought about getting married, one of the things that scared her the most was having to have sex or just enter some kind of sexually intimate relationship because of what she had gone through with FGM, and knowing that a lot of women that have experienced FGM have painful sex, and also do not enjoy sex as much as they would like. So already that anxiety and stress just from knowing that FGM was bound to play a role in her sex life was something that definitely impacted her mentally as well as physically. Next, please. And even when speaking with mothers who had, when speaking with mothers who had undergone FGM, there was always the discussions around the fact that like they did not want to have more children. And this was mainly, they were apprehensive because of how horrible their first delivery was and how painful it was. I had a woman talk about the fact that she thought that she was going to die from how bad it was, and just how long the entire delivery process took, that she, although she wanted more kids, she was definitely very, very scared of having more kids. Next. All right. So I think one of the most important things is, I'm really glad that there's platforms like Sahiyo where people are able to discuss FGM, because in a lot of cultures, especially where FGM is practiced, there's a lot of quietness and hush hush when discussing topics around sex and sexuality. And that makes it harder to seek help or realize that what you're going through is something that requires seeing a professional about. Because even when discussing sex and sexuality with the participants of my research, I would, directly say sex, but they would, instead of like directly talking about sex, they would rather just be like, oh, when I get married, to insinuate that that's when they're going to have any kind of sexual relationships. So I think it's definitely important that as researchers or as anyone that's working within FGM in general, to have more discussions around sex and sexuality, especially what kind of pain women are going through, to be able to understand how to better serve their needs. And I think it's also important to well, for my research, I think it's important that there needs to be increased studies around FGM and intimacy, just so that women know how to better maneuver sex and sexual desire and the intimacy in general. Next, please. So this leads me to just say again that there's an increased need for conversations about sex and intimacy, especially within partnerships as well as with survivors, because through my work around FGM and through research in general, I've realized that women are usually more comfortable speaking with one another, and through conversations with one another, they're able to discuss what they've basically what they've had to deal with in terms of FGM, and what has worked for them and what hasn't worked for them. And that way it makes it easier, I guess, to just have open and healthy discussions around women's bodies and survivors' bodies especially, and how to move forward. And there's also definitely a huge need for legislation around FGM, but legislation should also include education and resources for women who have undergone FGM. I'm just thinking back when I worked for a certain nonprofit that also did work around FGM, and one of the things that a lot of women had brought up was the fact that anytime they were ready to give birth, if they were survivors of FGM, especially type 3 FGM, doctors would automatically tell them that they needed to get a C-section, versus actually talking them through the possibility of a vaginal birth, which is something that is still possible through FGM. So just having the understanding that there are ways of healing and there are ways of moving forward versus as a survivor of FGM. And also, stuff around clitoral reconstruction, again, in able to gain sexual pleasure versus just accepting or just only believing that there's no way to have any form of sexual pleasure as a survivor of FGM. Next slide, please. I think that's, So this is just to remember that FGM doesn't mean that there won't be any arousal or sexual pleasure, or that you can't have a fulfilling sexual life. So it's important to communicate with partners again, to talk about sexual needs and how to better find ways to find pleasure. So learning more about erogenous zones and other ways that you might feel arousal and pleasure, and just deciding on other ways to foster sexual intimacy with your partner. Thank you. And these are the ways to reach heart. Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I know Heart is doing such amazing work. So I can also share some of that information in the chat as well if people are interested. And I think if we can go to the next slide, I will hand it over to you, Maria, for the Q&A session. And again, for our audience members, if you have any questions you'd like to ask the panelists, please feel free to submit those in the Q&A box.
Hey everyone, thanks so much both to Nazneen and Haddi for giving us those presentations, and we really wanted to be able to provide both overall understanding about wellness, and then also Haddi, you mentioned at the very end recognizing that there are multiple ways of healing, and I think Nazneen, you gave us a really great presentation of the pelvic floor and really the trauma that happens, and how pelvic floor therapy can also be an option in terms of healing for women who may have undergone female genital cutting or mutilation as well too. So we wanted to ask a couple of questions, but also just preserve a lot of time for audience members who might like to ask a question. So if you have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A box, and hopefully we'll have time to have the speakers to respond to them. But first off, Nazneen, I just wanted to follow up on your presentation, and you had mentioned the important role of having a holistic care of providers too. So what role do doctors or therapists and other health professionals really play in healing? And what are some tips on how healthcare providers can offer better services to survivors of female genital cutting along their healing journey? And then this might be a very long question, so you can do it in multiple parts. But then the other question was like, how can sexual and romantic partners support survivors of female genital cutting through this healing process as well?
So for the first question, what role do doctors and therapists, other healthcare professionals play? It is important to see someone who is specialized in pelvic floor, who is specialized in pelvic floor and understands it. Not every physical therapist or OBGYN or urologist, who are the main doctors most people go to for pelvic floor, specialize in the pelvic floor. So it's very important to find that I personally feel all of us across the healthcare field should get more training in pelvic floor during schooling. The pelvic floor and the pelvis it's almost like a taboo topic in most professions and most societies. It's like it doesn't exist, let's not talk about it. And so there definitely needs to be more education on both ends and more open dialogue about it. People should not be scared to ask questions or ashamed, and vice versa. Even in the profession, we tend to just be like, all right, yeah, we know about the pelvic floor, let's move on. So definitely education, and the healthcare practitioners that are specializing in it are do great things. We have a lot of resources here I know the resources in New York City because I work here, and we have some great practitioners here. And then for sexual and romantic partners at my clinic, we always encourage patients to bring in their partners or a friend or a family member into the therapy session if they want, so that they can have a better understanding. We teach them about the anatomy, how the pelvic floor works, and that they can also be a part of the healing journey. And we also teach them some stuff, like some techniques that they can do at home for their partner. So it's two people on this healing journey versus feeling all alone and trying to do it on your own.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. I think all of that is so important, and really thinking about, again, how could your partner help with healing as well too, particularly when it comes around sex. And I think, Haddi, your presentation really talked about the healing and wellness and the difficulties of having sexual relationships too, and what that's like. I have a question for you, but Nazneen made me sort of think, and I don't know if your study covered this, so it might not have, but did you at all have any interviews or information around partners in healing and wellness? And you may not have, but it just kind of made me wonder.
No, I did not. But I think that's definitely something that's interesting to look at.
Yeah, and there might be, and if anybody who's attending does know of that research, please feel free to share it too, because I do think that that's something that we haven't really looked at before, or else I'm not really aware, but I do think it's an important thing to think about. During our first part one of this webinar a year ago, we had a speaker, Sariam Kamara, who really talked a lot about her work with her partner around enjoying her sex life too. And she also does a lot of work with survivors to help them look at what does healing look like? How can you find sexual pleasure too? And it's a lot, and she really talked about both mental and physical healing around that. But that's just something to think about. But Haddi, I do have another question for you. This was another question that was unanswered from our event last year, but with, thinking about wellness, do you have any strategies for breaking the taboo around female genital cutting or mutilation, and how also community-based organizations can work directly with community members to end the practice here in the US or abroad? I know your research was based in the Gambia.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it was based in the Gambia, but I've also done work in the US as well. And I think one of the first things is always speaking with the community, like, identifying key stakeholders within the communities to speak to before directly going in there and talking to other community members, because I know that we've had a lot of issues where, like, when talking about FGM, there's an assumption that you're coming in with a Western perspective and you're just gonna come and tell everyone that, oh my gosh, it's bad. But when when you're going into a community without really them, I guess, accepting you or accepting what you have to say, it's a lot harder to get any work done, because again, there's an assumption that if you're against FGM, then you just have to have some kind of Western mindset, and you're, because it's a cultural thing, so it's you're trying to forcing people to step outside of their culture, which is not the truth. So I think speaking with members and also just knowing what exactly the taboos are within that community. So why is FGM being practiced in a certain community? Why are they holding on to it so dearly? I have one example where in the Gambia, actually, again with the nonprofit I was working for at that time, there was a certain community that we had gone into to talk about FGM and just ask them why it was they had continued the practice. And one of the reasons was that if they don't practice FGM, then girls are going to get pregnant, which I think that kind of thinking is some kind of I think it's a major symptom around a lack of sex education and comprehensive sex education in general, because I think that in regards to your question, I think one of the strategies is employing sex education or comprehensive sexuality education as a way to tackle FGM, because a lot of the reasons that communities and people give for the continuation of FGM are issues that I believe can be solved through sex ed. Stuff like, oh, if my child doesn't have FGM, then she's gonna go get pregnant. No, if your child is educated enough around sex and sexuality and is protecting herself, is using condoms, or has enough knowledge to decide that they actually don't want to have sex until they're married, they can prevent themselves from getting pregnant without really, going through the trauma and hurt of FGM. Mm-hmm. And yeah, so I think just that, and communication in general, continuously communicating and talking about FGM, because it's still such a taboo in so many communities. So having conversations and continuous discussions around FGM, I think, is a way to tackle some of the taboos and stigma around it.
I definitely agree with you with all of that. Thank you so much for sharing and uplifting. Also, just really the importance of sexual education as a prevention, particularly when it is connected to those ideas of justification that FGMC has done for sexuality or controlling sexuality, which is obviously not something any of us are promoting, but it's as a way to also kind of talk about what are other ways to have safe sex too. So I think that that's really important. So I wanted to turn to audience questions. We have quite a lot of questions that have come in. And I wanted to ask if let's see. Farzana has asked a question, and I can answer it, but I'm wondering if Farzana would be willing to ask her question live. If not, I can ask the question. Kate, would you be willing to promote?
Yeah, I just promoted her now, so she should be rejoining as a panelist.
Oh, great.
Oh, hey.
Hi,
Thanks.
Farzana.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. So my question was for Nazneen, and it was just how might somebody decide when it's the right time for them to see a pelvic floor therapist? What kinds of symptoms beyond like obvious pain would tell you to do that?
Hi, Farzana. That's a great question. So symptoms can, besides pain, include incontinence, constipation, feeling of heaviness in the pelvis, which is a prolapse, difficulty inserting a tampon, difficulty having a gynecological exam with a speculum, pain or discomfort with clothing, with jeans, stockings, sitting on a bicycle, on a chair, discomfort with that. And so you have to be ready to see a pelvic floor PT. It is very intimate treatment. We're, evaluating, assessing, and treating the pelvic floor. So it's like a gynecological exam, but without the stirrups. So you have to be ready for it as well. Except for if you've had, the only time we ask patients to wait is if they've had surgery or a C-section or childbirth, to come in 6 weeks later, 6 weeks post-surgical.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Great, thanks for that question. So I think, Kate, there's another question by Catherine, and so we were wondering if we could promote her to answer live as well too. So we will promote you to panelists.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for taking my question as well. And I was really curious, my question was for Nazneen as well. And I was curious as to your thoughts on, or if there's any research around the impact of sort of the actual physical impact of FGC on the pelvic floor. So direct impacts from the actual cutting itself, or whether you feel that a lot of the pelvic floor impacts result more from the potential psychological trauma of FGC, of fear and hesitation around really any activity in that vulvar vaginal area as a result of that, and that tension and that stress maybe has more of an impact on the pelvic floor muscles. I was just curious in your thoughts on that topic. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Hi, Catherine. So yes, of course, FGC has a psychological impact, and that's why we encourage patients to also, get psychological therapy side by side with physical therapy, like talk therapy, because we're not, we can help them find the right resource. We're not trained in psychology, so we don't, that's not in the scope of our practice. How FGC affects is, for example, the tip of the clitoris, right? It has a nerve going to the pudendal nerve. One of the branches goes to the tip of the clitoris. If the clitoris is cut or traumatized or nicked, it is going to cause scar tissue there, which is going to then affect the nerve, which is then going to affect all the pelvic floor muscles that take these two muscles that take origin from the clitoral hood. So then you're going to have pelvic floor pain, which is real physical pain versus just psychological pain. And I explain, it's like when you're young and you see fire and you want to touch it because you're attracted to it, and then you feel the heat and you go away from it. So it's the same thing with sexual pain. Someone tries to have intercourse or insert a tampon or a speculum, and you have pain and you go away from it. And so then every time you try to, the muscles contract, which is physical, and then there's a psychological impact. So they both work together. So everyone should, we need to balance, and that's where a multidisciplinary team comes into play. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Great. So we have another question. This one's a little more specific, and so I'll ask it out loud. But if that person would like to speak out loud, do let us know. But are there any resources for FGMC? Sorry, I lost my screen for a second. Are there any resources for FGMC survivors who come from Christian or Catholic communities? This would refer to survivors of cutting, mutilation, severe genital trauma due to sexual abuse or rape in non-Muslim communities. So one thing I do want to just mention with this question is that we do recognize that FGMC is a global issue. That means that it occurs in survivors of all different backgrounds, all different religions, all different economic statuses. There was a report that came out last year that showed that it is occurring in 92 countries around the world. And I do think that sometimes there are forms of FGMC that aren't talked about as much, as such as the one that this person is asking about due to sexual abuse or rape as well too. And I think in general, it would be maybe helpful, Nazneen, as well too. I'm assuming pelvic floor therapy can help within those types of situations as well too. In terms of specific resources, I think there are other resources maybe on some of the websites, which we could share with the USN FGMC network, for instance. But if anyone else knows of resources, please let me know. But Haddi or Nazneen, do you have any thoughts with that question?
Hi, so we don't have specific resources based on different communities. And I think this question is more, would be more psychological therapy or psychotherapy, talk therapy versus physical therapy. As physical therapists, we work with everyone where it's not specific to a community.
It's the same too. I don't have any resources that is specific to religion. Yeah.
Yeah, and definitely, I think that's a really interesting or important question. I don't know of any community specific work around it, but I do think that potentially, as Nazneen had mentioned, thinking about mental health support too, and how that could be helpful, and the connection with the trauma that you've undergone is something to think about. We can, in a follow-up, if we find out about other resources, we're happy to send that out. So sorry, we don't have more information at this time though too, but thank you for bringing that question up. And then, okay, so another question I had is just relating in general, related to the idea of storytelling. And Haddi, I was wondering if I could ask you this question: if in your research or maybe in your work with heart, how have you seen the idea of storytelling? Can that be used as a tool potentially in connection with well-being? And have you seen it being used? Or if your research talked a little anything about that as well too?
I think storytelling is a great tool when it comes to just in general. I'm a qualitative researcher, so I love being able to listen to other people's stories, and not necessarily always feeling like you have to quantify something. So I think it's a very important tool, even if it's just like could you repeat the last part of the question? Sorry,
sure. If in terms of how it might work in terms of healing or supporting healing.
In terms of in terms of how it might support healing, I think as humans, as human beings, we have this thing where just knowing that, first of all, telling your story in itself is a form of healing, but also hearing someone else tell their story and have it being similar to yours is another, because just feeling, feeling seen, feeling like, okay, I'm not alone. I think it's definitely a great way to just go about any kind of healing and any kind of work around FGM, because and just hearing someone else's story, knowing that, okay, you know what, they've gone through this and they're able to, I guess they're able to move forward in a way that is also so a form of motivation to be able to move forward with your healing. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, completely. And I bring that up as well because here at Sayo, we definitely believe storytelling is a very powerful tool, and we have a workshop coming up. Everybody saw 2 Voices videos that were created by those who had connections to FGMC, and we have another workshop coming up in January this year. And so if anyone is interested in taking part in that, it's a digital storytelling workshop, please let us know. We can also put the information. Oh, it looks like Kate has already put the application in the chat box. But that's one of our, we really love that project, and it's amazing the sense of healing people get by joining with a community of others who have connected in these experiences too. So looks like another question has come up. So I will ask this question. To what extent is the cost of healthcare a barrier to accessing these types of therapies, including access to mental health and psychosocial support, given a multifaceted approach may be needed for some survivors? Nazneen, I don't know if you have any thoughts related to that too. And I definitely recognize that access to healthcare is a challenge too.
Yes, access to healthcare is a challenge, and I think it's based more because of how the insurance system is set up in, at least in New York City. That's where my experience is. Most pelvic floor physical therapists are out of network. It's, you know, my clinic, we bill the insurance for the patient. We take that out of the patient's hands. We do charge, most pelvic floor PTs do charge a fee for service. And that is definitely a barrier. But we do spend an hour with a patient one-on-one in a private treatment room, and it's all manual therapy. We don't operate like a gym or an exercise center. So it's all manual therapy to stretch the muscles, do things that, you know, the patient is unable to do on their own for their pelvic floor. And we teach the patients a lot. We've had patients come for like 2 or 3 visits, and then we have some who come for longer. But yes, it's most definitely a challenge.
Yeah, thanks for sharing as well. So I'm just realizing we're actually coming to the end of our event, and so I don't think we have any time to answer additional questions, but I did want to mention, it looks like some people have added resources in the chat box. So thank you so much for sharing resources. We definitely know that there's a wealth of knowledge out there too from our attendees, so we appreciate that. And we'll try to include these resources in a follow-up email to everyone as well after this event, for all those who have registered for the event. But with that, I just wanted to ask Nazneen and Haddi, if there's any last thoughts that you might like to share before we conclude our event.
I just think I want to add, in regards to the last question, what Nazneen said is, you know, it's definitely very true that, and what the person who asked the question said too, in terms of health, you know, having health insurance and just healthcare, and just the financial barrier around it. But I think in terms of psychosocial support as well, having forms of group therapy is quite helpful. So even if it's just survivors themselves meeting up and you know, having discussions within themselves is often sometimes a form of psychosocial support. And you know, and I think also it's one of the things that nonprofits, it'll be great if nonprofits were able to invest in having people that were able to offer psychosocial support to a lot of the survivors that they're working with. But I just wanted to add that in. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. Very good point.
Last bit, I think all women and men should advocate for their pelvic health. There's not a lot of information out there. So with whatever little information you have, when you know something's not right, advocate for your own health with your healthcare practitioners, have your voice heard so you can get the right help and the right care.
Great. I definitely agree with that too. I think it's important to advocate for our own health. And with that, we're coming to the end of our event, but I just wanted to pop up our contact info at Sayo if anyone is interested in connecting with us. If the speakers are comfortable and you want to share any contact information, please feel free to do so in the chat box. Otherwise, if folks have questions for our speakers, feel free to contact Sayo as well, and we can forward them to the speakers too. But thank you everybody for attending. Thank you to our speakers, and I hope you all have a good rest of your day wherever you're located.